now, similar type talk that Jeff gave, but in dairy cattle. You've got that handout coming around. So Chad, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And Ray, let's do a 10-minute warning this time. 5 minutes didn't work last talk, so we got to rein these people in that like to blabber. So it'll be a similar talk to what Jeff did, just from a dairy perspective. And us in our company, and I guess our geography, we're up north, we're more focused on dairy cows and dairy producers than beef, just because that's what's available. But these warm season annuals do have a place for high-producing dairy cows, and we're going to talk about that today. So, and the overriding question that we get, again, we're not talking to people that have a heritage of growing sorghums. They say, why in the world would I grow sorghum or sorghum Sudan and try to feed that to my cows? This is what I end up with. And 20 years ago, and even still sometimes today, this is true. They can be a mess. Management matters, but we can manage around these things. The two reasons why people do not use these is again, this and the prussic acid, which is going to be discussed later. We can manage around both these things. And so this is the good old days when you think of sorghum and it's 10 feet tall or something. So just by frame of reference, the little short guy in the picture over there is me. That's more of a conventional, and this is forage sorghum, not sorghum Sudan, but traditional forage sorghum. This is what we have now. Again, we talked about that brachytic dwarf trait. So similar yield between those two pictures, believe it or not. This is in Texas, and this guy harvested the day after we visited. That was 20, almost 30 tons of silage per acre. So good corn silage yields, and I could almost see over the top. So height isn't the only indicator of yield. Dent stands make a big difference. And you can notice here, thinking back to my previous talk, those tall guys there, those are probably spontaneous mutations there that just got a little tall. This has been mentioned earlier, but here's putting it in a yield perspective. The sorghum family is very efficient at using water. So to put it in a tonnage basis of forage, 1 inch of water will get you 0.84 tons of corn silage, or 1.76, almost double the tons of sorghum Sudan in this case. Now most years from here north, we don't really worry about water. It is what it is. In Texas and out west where I live, we irrigate, so these kind of numbers are very important. But it's only important here on years when it doesn't rain. So, and this is actually a photo from upstate New York, believe it or not. They're planning these warm seasons even up there. And who would have thought you would have a year where there was almost 6 tons of silage, and that's at 35% moisture. That's not dry matter. Almost 6 tons of corn silage. You doubled the yield with sorghum Sudan. Now that's not going to happen every year up there. But a recurring theme in dairy, and I'm sure beef too, is a relatively new term to us, and that is risk management. It used to be just, what can I do to produce the most, and not hedge bets. We have to hedge now. So from here north, maybe 1 or 2 years out of 10, will sorghums outperform corn. But you sure are glad you have them on those 1 or 2 years. Was it, my years run together, was 2011 the bad drought year? 2012? 12. We had dairy producers in Wisconsin tell us, my forage sorghum saved my farm. So, are they going to plant the whole farm? Someone mentioned that earlier. No, and you shouldn't plant the whole farm, but we would make a case that no matter where you are geographically, some of these warm season annuals probably should be in your rotation at some level, just for those years when your normal traditional forages don't get it done. Good point, good point. And that's going to be especially true as they get these shorter season sorghums and Sudans available. So again, this is typically what we think of when we think of especially BMR. Remember, we reduced the lignin. Lignin holds things up. They don't have it, they fall over. So the first BMRs that came out, that's what they look like. Not too pretty from a farm perspective. Put that BMR trait in these little short guys, and they stand. So, what's so special about these forage sorghums? And again, I'm talking about the whole family. This would apply to Sudan, Sorghum-Sudan hybrids, and forage sorghum itself. We've heard about these a lot. BMR, of course. Someone's mentioned higher NDFD. We'll look at some numbers. Simply that just means more digestible fiber. Our thinking on fiber has changed a lot. More hemicelluloses and pectins, those are technically they're fiber, but they're the more digestible fractions. And more 5-carbon sugars, we'll talk about that more in a second. So more milk or meat is really the name of the game, and these warm seasons can really do that. So you say, okay, BMR is important, but I'm a corn guy. I can do BMR corn and do a lot of the same things. And nutritionally, that can be true, but we haven't maybe talked about this one as much. And when we say fertilizer here, we're talking about nitrogen. You can get by with about a third less nitrogen compared to a corn crop. And in fact, you need to. Another good way to make these sorghums fall over is to feed them too much nitrogen. Too much nitrogen, and then they will have a lot more tendency to lodge. So 120 units of nitrogen compared to 200 to grow a corn crop. And that's real money, 26 bucks an acre a couple of years ago. Third to half less water. Now, for this part of the country, we don't really put a number on that, so we'll subtract that when we get a total. But for me, where I live, irrigation costs me 125 bucks a year. So that's a real number, and I got to get the most I can out of that 125 bucks. Corn is not the way to do that in a hot, dry climate. So twice the sugar. So you can use more, and research has shown that about 20% more in the TMR. If I'm putting more forage into the TMR, what am I not putting in? Grain. So it becomes cheaper then to get similar milk production, and that's a huge number. So converting that back to a per acre basis, and again, this is compared to even BMR corn. This is a big one. Now, we're seed industry guys, some of us here, and we love selling bags of corn. That's a lot of money, especially BMR corn. But the reality is there are better options. Sorghum and even sorghum Sudans at 50 pounds to the acre, seed cost is drastically different than corn. And if you can get similar results on the other end, I think producers need to take a look at it. So you can save 70 bucks an acre just on seed cost alone. Doing forage sorghum versus corn. So, okay, they're both highly digestible NDFD. They're both BMR, so that's a wash. What's our total then? If I'm in Texas or Kansas, I would say it's maybe approaching $600 an acre. We'll subtract out 200 bucks because water is what the good Lord gives us here. But still, maybe up to 300 bucks an acre savings using sorghum versus corn. So, should you do the whole farm? No, because it's not always going to be a good year agronomically, but you should probably do some. That's the overriding theme.
Chad, are these numbers that you're showing us, are they based on the premise that both the sorghum and the corn will yield the same?
Yes, good question. Yes, same amount of tons of silage per acre, yes. And it's actually the study was done in Texas. That's why they did the water. Any other questions? Okay, we'll talk about a big problem in the dairy world, and that is lameness. If you look at this girl right here, she's holding her foot up. We don't know what happened in her case. Lots of causes of lameness. Think about life as a dairy cow. They're walking on concrete a lot. Their feet probably weren't intended for that, so that can cause some issues. But again, 42% of the lameness that we see, is due to nutrition. When we say nutrition, those girls are getting too much starch, too much grain, too much corn. We're doing that to get the milk production out of them, but it has physiological effects elsewhere. So 1 in 4 cows walking around in this country of ours is lame to some degree. And not quite half of that lameness can be attributed to feeding them too much starch. So what can we do? there is a solution to this. How they score it. I should point this out. So if I were on a dairy and I was surveying the herd for lameness, I wouldn't see these. Locomotion score of 2, I couldn't pick it up. You have to know what you're doing to be able to see that. But where you and I could start to see, hey, that cow's a little bit lame, we're already losing intake. If you lose intake, you lose milk. So by the time I can visibly detect a cow is lame, I'm losing 5 pounds a day of production from her. And without treatment, a lot of times you'll just go right on up the scale until she leaves because she's too lame. Just a comparison here, and I want you to key in on this starch column. This is Sorghums Sudans here, and so here's the BMR, here's the non-BMR. I broke them out like Chris did. Starches is obviously the same. No seeds here, not much starch. But our corn crop, on average, if we make corn silage, it's 33% of that dry matter is starch. So we don't have that in Sorghum Sudan. Keep that in mind because we'll look at some performance here in a minute. Crude protein, I'd already mentioned, is higher. And this is strictly a maturity deal. If you let Sorghum Sudan completely head out, it's going to lose protein too, like Jeff talked about in his presentation. But at our maturities that we work with at harvest, there's a lot more protein and more, in the case of BMR, more digestible NDF in the sorghums than even corn. So I was flipping through pictures earlier and I think Bill asked, is that shredlage? That's not shredlage. That is forage sorghum when it's chopped. Doesn't that look beautiful? That is what digestible fiber looks like. Looks like cotton candy. Beautiful stuff. Cows love it, ferments really well. So that is a solution to this acidosis thing going on in the dairies. They can get their energy from digestible fiber instead of all that starch. So we'll look at a couple of papers here, and one name that pops up again and again in literature when it comes to BMR corns and BMR sorghums is a guy by the name of Rick Grant. He did some of his work at Nebraska, but he's at a research institution in New York again, the Minor Institute. And here's a study. Now this is forage sorghum, so the one cut, you're doing it equivalent to corn silage. We'll look at a few slides here. So just looking at individual parameters here, NDF is not that different between normal, BMR, or corn silage. So in the old days, when all we could look at was NDF, we didn't know about NDF-D yet, we didn't really see that much difference between all these things. And lignin, of course, is a bit different. So what happens when you put them in a diet? We won't go through all the numbers here, but I really like this study because the only thing he changed going through is either they got conventional sorghum, BMR sorghum, or corn silage in the exact same amounts. Grain mix and alfalfa didn't change. So what happens on the other end? Milk production then, corn silage is the gold standard, so there were 76 pounds of milk per day. Normal sorghum, 74, so a little less, but statistically it's a wash. BMR sorghum, definitely better than conventional sorghum, but a wash statistically compared to corn. That's okay. We can equal corn silage production with a forage sorghum without all that starch. That's a huge, huge deal for cow health. Composition, of course, isn't that much different. Here's, again, we're talking efficiency a lot, which even when I started in the industry 10 or 15 years ago, we never talked about efficiency. Just feed them as much as you can, get as much production out the other end as you can. That's changing. Cost structures have changed on everything we do. So pounds of fat-corrected milk divided by dry matter intake, the most efficient thing up here by just a smidge was BMR sorghums. So let's look at Sorghum Sudan then. So we're not talking a one-cut forage sorghum in this case. We're talking probably haylage or baleage made out of Sorghum Sudan. And if we were looking at this again 10 years ago, before we knew about NDF-D, digestible NDF, this is another thing that kept Sorghum Sudan off of dairies. Look at all that fiber. I can't feed all that fiber to cows and get any milk. Too much NDF, that's straw. Maybe that used to be true, but with BMR that is not. But if you just look at straight levels of NDF, there's twice the fiber in BMR silage of sorghum Sudan as there is corn silage. Again, corn silage has all that starch. Lignin's higher. That doesn't look good. But if anybody's got a calculator, the best way to look at lignin, divide 4.6 by 66.2. So lignin as a percent of NDF. Because what the lignin is doing is it's binding with the NDF and tying that up. Lignin doesn't interfere with starch in corn silage, so that's a bit of a bogus number, if that makes sense. So anytime you see lignin, we're trained to think lignin is bad. High lignin numbers, bad forage. Not necessarily. Lignin as a percent of fiber, that's the measurement that matters. So, and when you do that math, this comes out better, actually, than corn silage. Does that make sense? And you get these feed tests anymore, and they're as long as your leg. You get all these numbers, and you don't know what half of them are. One of the expressions they usually have is lignin as a percent of dry matter. That's what that is. Lignin as a percent of NDF, and that's becoming the number that matters more. Okay, sugar versus starch again. Here's something I found from Canada, and I broke one of the cardinal rules. I have more than 20 words on this slide, but I thought I could get away with it because you can read them in your handout. Although sugar is fermented more rapidly in the rumen than starch, emerging evidence shows that feeding sugar as a replacement for corn grain may reduce the risk for ruminal acidosis. So we think put starch in there, put sugar in there, it breaks down in the rumen the same time. We're going to risk acidosis. It's a different pathway. Starch breakdown leads to acidosis. Sugar in the form of 5-carbon sugar, fructose, does not. So again, you can get that rapidly fermentable energy and not have to deal with the implications of starch. So this is a really, really big thing. Another reason why dairy farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota are trying to figure out how in the world can I grow some of this warm season forage. So, look at some composition here. This is 2 diets run side by side. We're still talking about Rick Grant, and it's not on the columns here, but this column is what if I include sorghum Sudan at 35% of the ration, 45% of the ration. Corn silage, same thing. What if it's 35% of the ration, 45%? And again, starch in corn silage is round figures. 30% of that dry matter is starch. We're half of that with sorghum Sudans. So same energy, a lot less starch, a lot less foot problems, a lot better cow health. Sugar. Doesn't seem like much. But what do we know about making silage? What makes good silage? High sugar forage or low sugar forage? Those bugs eat sugar, right? So this stuff ensiles really, really well. Better than you think it should, partly because of all that sugar. So, get to the end of the day. What's the deal? Now look at something interesting. Dry matter intakes were lower for these sorghum Sudan diets. That's bad. Milk production is driven by intake, right? We got to get more feed into those girls to get more milk out. Not necessarily. Look at fat-corrected milk, and we're going to say that that's statistically the same, even though they ate less feed per day. That doesn't happen very often. The amazing thing to me about this, you ever see, there's not a whole lot of dairy cows left in Kentucky, but anybody ever see a fat dairy cow? It doesn't really happen very often. They're made to put all their fat into milk, but we actually, with lower intakes, got similar milk, and we gained weight at the same time. It's unbelievable what this stuff can do in diets. Typically, we're happy with high lactation cows if they'll just maintain weight. So over 4 weeks, these girls eating corn silage, we're going to say stayed the same. We actually saw a little bit of gain over here. Exactly, yeah. It's same as beef cows. If body conditions going south, so is your reproduction performance. So other bit of trivia. What's the average number of lactations you get out of a dairy cow in America? Between 2 and 3. She pays for herself in 3. So you see a problem? So we have to change the way we're feeding cows. We've figured that out. We're doing too much starch right now to get those 100 pounds of 100 pounds a day milk yields. We've got to figure out something different, and sorghums can be part of that. Rumen pH also higher in the sorghum Sudans because we don't have that starch driving it down. So, lots of numbers. Sorry to bore you with all the numbers. If you are more of a visual person like me, you can think of it this way. When it comes to corn silage, where does the energy come from? Half of it, roughly, or 60% maybe, comes from starch, 40% from plant sugars. BMR Sorghum-Sudans, on the other hand, where does their energy come from? 80% of it or more comes from plant sugars. A little bit of it comes from starch. So, in a nutshell, that's why these things belong in a dairy diet. Yeah?
Also, you can substitute some hay and hay leaf for that also. Sorghums will take the place of corn silage and hay.
Yeah, good point, Dennis. Yeah, you can use them in a lot of different ways. Now, someone may cover some of this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. If you look at, and I'm speaking specifically of a forage sorghum plant, it has that big ball of seeds on the top. They ripen from the top down, so it's ready to harvest when the ones at the top are starting to get a little doughy. You're not looking for grain out of this stuff because, again, once that grain gets hard, it's BBs. It's not worth having. It's not like corn. So when it's at soft dough, or maybe before, it's ready to go. We wait for soft dough for one reason, and that's because about the time it's at soft dough, your moisture is right to make silage. We don't really care about those seed heads on the top, but you're at about 70, 72% moisture probably at that point.
And that's a little bit higher than most people are used to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so a lot of times when you're making sorghum or you don't usually make silage out of sorghum Sudans, but you can, you're going to be at 70, 75%. If you did that with corn silage, you would be really worried about juicing and about proper fermentation. But we don't see that. Again, I think it's because there's so much sugar in there, we get such rapid fermentation, we can get away with things that we can't in corn. One of the reasons we can do that is we're going to recommend a longer chop length, at least 3/4, but we tell people an inch and 1/4. The less cuts you have, the less cells you're rupturing, the less leaking you're going to have, less chance for juicing. We don't put it in writing, but we have people at over 80% moisture putting up sorghum silage. You probably want to use some inoculant, but they have it and not as much juicing as you think. So there's a little bit of difference when it comes to harvest management here, but don't be afraid of 72% moisture with sorghum for silage. And do not use a processor. Again, we don't want to chop up those pieces. This stuff has digestible fiber. We like those long pieces of sorghum silage. The cows can actually break them down really, really well. We're not trying to break those kernels. Broke the rules again, but this is going to tie in with one of Chris's slides. When it comes to feed testing, there's the in vitro stuff that we can do that's actually in rumen fluid, or there's NIR, which is what we all like to do. When it comes to sorghums, we don't have very robust data sets yet. I think this is maybe, Chris, what you were getting at. So again, Dr. Grant, this is a couple years old now, he's figured out a system. If you get an NEL, that's what a lot of the dairy nutritionists like to use, NEL calculation, and it says, let's say 0.6 on forage sorghum, which you'll see some of those. He says that's not representative of how it feeds. You need to add 0.12 to 0.15, and then you can actually balance a ration around it. Now, the world is changing. Some labs are getting better at this, some are not. So what I would encourage you to do, how many folks run stuff through Kentucky's lab? Okay, when you have samples or have producers do samples, the best thing to do is do a blind study. Split the sample, have half of it done NIR, half of it done wet chem. And if they're relatively close, your lab is probably doing right. Because there is no standard equation here. And there is no data set for BMR versus non-BMR as far as an industry. Some labs have done that on their own. So it's the Wild West on forage testing. But if you see one that looks a little off, don't necessarily believe it, get a wet chem done. That's for sorghums and Sudans. That's the best thing to do at this point. Right. Oh, good. Good. I'm
Kentucky's lab doesn't have a calibration for the sorghums, as far as I know.
a lot of what happens in a lot of labs, actually, they don't, like you said, they don't have an equation for sorghum Sudan or sorghums, so they're using a corn equation. That corn equation really wants to see starch, and there isn't any. So it kind of messes up what you're going to see. So the take-home message there is, if you have a question, do a wet chem. That will be your best bet at this point. Okay, and I think I made up for it, Ray. I'm done 2 minutes early this time. Any questions? Yeah.
You're talking about how, as far as fermentation goes, using the plant sugars rather than the starch. What kind of fermentation timeline would you look at on forage sorghums compared to corn silage?
Oh, that's a good question. So the question, I guess I better repeat it into here. What's the fermentation timeline before you want to start feeding this stuff compared to corn silage? The recommendation for corn silage is, what, 3 or 4 months, I think? Varies all the time, but cut that in half, probably. I mean, Dennis, what have you seen? There's guys who fed it right away almost, but...
We've had pH drop as quick as 2 weeks, and he no heat it. So as soon as you reach in there, you smell it, and it smells good, start feeding.
So,
We're going to have to wait on that starch.
yeah. So a couple of weeks of fermentation works for this stuff. So again, in a diverse system, if I got some corn silage and I have some of this, I can feed this first while I'm waiting for my corn silage to cook. Good question.
Any other questions real quick for Chad?